Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Melbourne, both here in person tonight and those of you who are joining us online. My name is Mark Cassidy. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research here at the University of Melbourne. Maybe we should do name, affiliation and pet love and energy. So Mark Cassidy, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Offshore Wind Energy Researcher as well. Look, I just acknowledge that we meet tonight on the lands of the Wurundjeri, the Wurrung and the Boon Wurrung people, and I pay the custodians of these lands, their elders past and present, my deepest respects. And just also to acknowledge how important Indigenous knowledges are in all of our research efforts, but I think particularly as Australia moves to net zero, how learning for Indigenous people is going to be really important in that journey, and of course in the reconciliation journey that this country is going through. I also extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are here tonight or online or on the lands of our collaborators, the University of Queensland or Princeton University. I'd just like to take a moment just to say a few things about Net Zero Australia and make just a few thanks. This has really been a remarkable collaboration between this university, the University of Melbourne, and the Universities of Queensland and Princeton University. While this evening's seminar launches the first report for what's known as the second phase of Net Zero Australia, I know the Net Zero Australia team has been working really, really hard, refreshing its priorities, fundraising and analysis. So I just wanted to reiterate that this isn't the launch of phase two. It's not the start of phase two, and you're going to see not just tonight, this report, but a dribbling out or maybe a flooding out of reports and analysis and assessments in the months and the time ahead. So get on the web, get on Twitter, whatever, because there's information around this important work that we're doing in this global challenge around decarbonising Australia. More work's going to come from this team very, very soon. On behalf of the University of Melbourne, can I just thank three groups in particular? I'd just first like to thank the Net Zero Australia team of the Universities of Queensland and Princeton. I've had some interactions, not that many, but I also hear how collaborative this work has been and what a fantastic example it is of how universities can come together and work collaboratively without silos for the benefit of really major challenges that this world faces. So thank you to Universities of Queensland and Princeton and the team involved. Second, I just would thank APA, APGA, Energy Australia, Iberdrola and the Future Energy CRC for your financial support for this phase two of Net Zero Australia project. And quite simply, this would not be possible without your support. So thank you so much. And finally, to the advisory group of Net Zero Australia for your deep, wide sectorial expertise, bringing that to the table for the project. I know it's making a huge difference for the team and for the project itself. So thanks so much for your generous and candid advice that you're giving to the Net Zero Australia project. So thanks you all for attending, and now I'd like to just introduce Associate Professor Simon Smart from the University of Queensland to commence this evening's proceedings. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Cassidy, for that kind introduction, and I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship on the lands on which we meet this evening, both here and wherever you may be online. So we have a packed agenda this evening, so let's get straight into it. There we are. So what is Net Zero Australia and what are we aiming to do for phase two of our study? Net Zero Australia is an independent project that is analysing net zero pathways for the Australian economy. In phase one, we presented what could net zero look like for Australia. For phase two, we want to move the conversation towards how can we get on track. And for that, we recognise that much deeper analysis is needed in specific areas. So we've prioritised three areas of focus. The first is a unified approach to decarbonisation, where we're seeking to use our modelling and analysis to inform nationwide strategies for planning and implementing large-scale decarbonisation projects. Biodiversity and land use and greenhouse gas management is one of the emerging areas of debate, and balancing that against balancing ecological preservation, agricultural productivity and carbon management at the same time as reaching net zero is an emerging space. Our phase one analysis took great strides in that area, and we're going to extend that in subsequent reports. And the last of those is, but not least of course, is people trust in the workforce. Balancing those community benefits, workforce preparedness, and household engagement across the net zero or energy transition. Now this is therefore the first of many planned reports and activities over the next over the time ahead. We have an annual conference in December this year, and as I said, we've got regular reports being released roughly every quarter. The next two reports are going to focus on our progress as a nation towards net zero and the integrated biodiversity protection and energy system planning piece. Onto who we are, and it's a good point actually to stop and emphasise that the Net Zero Australia project is an independent effort. It's independent of our advisors and our supporters, who we thank for their generous support and advice and time, but also of any government. And so whilst we try to listen to and take all advice seriously, including your own this evening as we go through our panel Q&A, we're not necessarily going to act on it. Quick acknowledgement of the team, as Mark said earlier. These are the folks who've done an amazing amount of work in pulling this together over the last few weeks and months, processing, reprocessing the data as new reports and updated information came flooding in, particularly over the last couple of months. And then let's start to talk about what the project does and doesn't do. So from the outset, it's important to acknowledge that our modelling doesn't seek to make predictions or forecasts. We use scenario analysis, a look into possible future worlds where we do or don't reach our net zero targets. Now, this is a busy space, as anybody who's watched the news over the last few weeks would appreciate. There are lots of different types of modelling and analysis out there. So again, we'd like to emphasise that our modelling is different to some of the other modelling that you may have seen in several key respects. The first of which is that we solve the energy system across the entire economy for what is effectively a lowest cost solution. So while we model the energy demand and supply and that balance hour by hour, day by day across the whole year with all the weather variability thrown in, we don't model any subsequent benefits or impacts that may ripple through the economy as a result of the transition. We also don't include any of the projected costs for damages caused by climate change, other than to note that these are very significant. But we're not climate scientists, we're engineers, as Michael and I are engineers, as a lot of the rest of the team, and we would therefore point you to the many studies on climate damages, including the one released last week. And we're going to highlight throughout the report where our approach may differ from others that are out there. So, onto the report. We've focused primarily on updating our previous efforts with new inputs because the world has changed significantly from 2023. And this time we've brought the focus back to domestic decarbonisation only. In terms of inputs, which is the last point but probably the most important, so I'm going to mention it first, we use all the information from the latest GenCost reports and all of the latest updates from the Australian Electricity Market Operator, some of you may know as AEMO. Many of those reports have come out in the last 1 or 2 months, so what we present here is effectively very hot off the press. In terms of the domestic system and what that means for how our results might differ from our phase 1 analysis, for those of you that are familiar with them. If you're not, those results are still up on the website, so please go check them out. But the focus on domestic decarbonisation means that we have largely placed the export opportunity out of scope for this particular update. Whereas in the first study, we analysed what it would look like if all our fossil exports were transformed into clean energy exports at the same value as energy today. Now that's a simplistic but useful take to show what might be required, but really the modelling of clean energy and clean commodity exports is a very complex task, and it is going to be the focus of a future report that we'll be releasing next year. So returning to this update, if we're not looking at all of our exports being transformed, then we have to think about what we do with our fossil industry, because the extraction of fossil fuels for exports generates domestic emissions, fugitives, direct emissions, and it consumes domestic energy as well. So we need to establish some kind of baseline for what's going to happen to these fossil industries in the future in a decarbonising world. And so we've therefore used the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook announced pledges scenario to establish a level of Australia's fossil exports by 2050, which reflects current global ambitions. That level there of roughly 7 exajoules is a reduction of more than half of what we export today. As a result, we've also reduced the storage potential for engineered CO2 removals. In phase one, a significant portion of the CCS or storage went to the decarbonisation of exports. Here, we're prioritising domestic emissions to be available for those hard-to-abate sectors if the model deems it to be the lowest cost option. Which brings us then to the scenarios that we have considered. There are 4, 2 of which we reach net zero, 2 of which with no emissions constraint applied. The first is the reference case. No emissions constraint and no government mechanisms modelled. You can consider this to be sort of a do-nothing new scenario, where the rates of energy efficiency and electrification continue to advance, but only at historic rates. It still considers the projected future costs of all the energy types. So in the reference case, renewable energy competes strictly on a total system cost basis. So we use it therefore to compare against the other cases to clearly indicate the costs that will occur regardless of whether Australia decarbonises. The second scenario is what we've deemed current policies. It has no emissions constraint, but does include current government mechanisms, modelled out to 2050, if they were funded and if they're significant. The caveat being that we haven't had time to include any of the significant policy announcements of last week. The next slide will provide a few more details on what we included there, other than to say that on the demand side, again, we're advancing at historic rates unless there's a specific increase from policy, like, for example, with the new vehicle emission standards. Which brings us to the first of our net zero scenarios. We impose an emissions constraint, a straight line from today to 2050, going from where we are to zero by 2050. Now, we've calculated the total emissions across each scenario, and we compare that to the IPCC's 6th assessment report, emissions budget, and attributed the temperature ranges using the current share of emissions, which is what you see in the bottom row there. But there are other approaches, and at this point, again, we reiterate, we're not climate scientists, and therefore we can't model the impacts of these emission budgets directly. Our methods of attribution, along with all of our other methods, are in the detailed documentation that you'll find on the website that accompanies this report. Achieving net zero by 2025 requires a very large uplift in annual capacity additions of all clean energy technologies. Now, the old adage is that all models are wrong, some models are useful. So in order to be useful, we have to impose some restrictions on how much each technology can be added in any particular year. We do this through a compound annual growth rate limit on annual additions. To remain technology neutral, we therefore adopt these growth rate constraints on the deployment of key technologies, including renewable electricity generation, geological CO2 sequestration capacity, and the retrofitting of a range of industrial processes with cleaner alternatives. That capacity rate is set at 10%, or capacity cap is set at 10%. These build rates are sufficiently high to ensure that the model can meet demand in each year and still achieve the net zero emissions by 2050. But importantly, doesn't allow very large clean energy industries to form in unrealistic short periods. The scenario also sees a very strong drive to electrification and energy productivity increases, such that there is nearly full electrification of transport and buildings by 2050. In this and the net zero extended timeline, nuclear energy is available to the model to choose if it's deemed part of the lowest cost solution for the energy mix. And the last one there is the net zero extended timeline, which models a net zero future with a less optimistic view on Australia's capacity to deploy large-scale infrastructure that's required to meet the emissions by mid-century. So this results in net zero being achieved in a future beyond 2050. The key differences compared with the net zero 2050 scenario are slower demand side transition, so slower appliance uptake and changeover to new vehicles, and a more constrained technology deployment rate. So that 5% compound annual growth rate instead of 10. So if we look at the emissions constraints and trajectories, on the right-hand side of this slide, we can see the imposed and modelled emissions trajectories of all the pathways. For noting, the net zero extended scenario reaches the net zero condition by roughly 2065. On the left, we expand a little bit more on what's included in the current policies. That is, to be included as a current policy, it had to be funded, a funded mechanism and not only a target. It had to make a significant contribution to the decarbonisation of the sector. And since a lot of these mechanisms are only aimed at short-term objectives, we extended them all out to 2050 using reasonable continuations of annual activity. Of the more than 100 that we examined at the state and federal level, there were 11 that were included. It's worth noting that there are many smaller policies that when we aggregate them up, they may add up to something significant. And so this may well be an underestimate of the actual abatement for this particular scenario. So let's therefore get into some results. So we have 13 key findings summarised across 4 categories. The evidence base for the findings will follow in the subsequent slides, but it's worth highlighting them now. Renewables dominate, with a 5 to 10% annual growth rate for many technologies in the net zero scenarios. Solar and batteries are prioritised. Firming is mainly provided by batteries and gas, with investment in batteries. Many different energy systems essentially achieve the same emissions at approximately the same total transition costs. The net zero scenarios need roughly 2 times the existing electricity infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and new CO2 pipelines and hydrogen pipelines. The emissions reduction is fastest in electricity, with transport and heavy industry being slower. Agriculture and the land sector is not expected to be a source of offsets for other sectors. And the counter to that, or the flip side of that, is that CCS has an important role to play in all decarbonised futures. The Commonwealth targets are achieved in 2031 or later, or 2038 or later, depending on the scenario that we look at. And additional action is needed to achieve the 82% renewables by 2030, with our models suggesting 2033 or later. Decarbonisation tasks and costs vary widely across end-use sectors, with industry the most impacted, and achieving net zero is capital intensive for both the supply and demand side. Moving then into the first category of our results. Primary energy. Several things stand out here. First, and somewhat unsurprisingly, in a net zero world, renewables dominate. Standout being solar in the gold and yellow colours, whilst wind in the light blue and biomass in the green play a significant but smaller role. The interplay between solar and wind is interesting, and we'll cover this in a few slides' time. But effectively, the projected cost declines for solar and batteries outstrip the capacity factors and time of day dynamics that may otherwise favour wind. Biomass, which our model is almost entirely composed of agricultural and forestry waste products, plays a significant role. But if the biomass costs aren't as projected, other renewables, will likely take up the slack. We also see a small ongoing role for natural gas and fossil liquids in the aviation and hard-to-abate industry sectors. These are, of course, offset through engineered carbon removals. If we look at the renewable build in more detail, we find that approximately 300 gigawatts of renewable capacity is needed to reach net zero by 2050. This is dominated by solar, as I said, which grows at approximately 10% year on year, with a maximum build rate of around 13 gigawatts a year, which is many times larger than the maximum historic build rates, which are shown in the black horizontal lines on the charts. Wind, however, sees capacity additions at the same rate or less than current maximums. Turning them to firming, and we find that once again both batteries and gas are needed for firming the system, with batteries in the lime green colour dominating the new investment. This is in line with the dominance of solar in the primary energy mix, and once again a function of sharply declining cost curves. We see no growth in pumped hydro beyond Snowy 2.0 or other firm generation, which includes no nuclear in the lowest cost solution. But there is a small growth in electrolysis and green hydrogen towards the end of the transition, which provides some flexible load options to the grid. Now, this is a really important slide that I'd like to take a little bit more time on. We want to talk about the optionality that exists for achieving the same objectives within 1% of the total net present value of the system net present value. That is to say, in simple language, there are many different energy mixes that achieve the same emissions trajectory at essentially the same total transition costs. We call this generating alternatives. So for each scenario, we generate an ensemble of about 152 alternative pathways, where in each one we maximize or minimize expenditure on a specific technology, whilst ensuring that the total net present value of the system is not more than 1% larger than our lowest cost solution. In each of those 152 alternative pathways, a different randomly chosen set of technologies is targeted for minimization or maximization. What this gives us is a spread of outcomes or technology portfolios. A large spread for a given technology, like we see for solar, onshore wind and batteries, indicates that investment in that technology can rise or fall substantially without meaningfully affecting system cost. Conversely, outcomes that remain unchanged across alternative pathways, like we see for CCS or gas power generation or pumped hydro, either can't vary much without driving large increases in cost or are otherwise constrained in some way. The implications of the analysis are striking. There is strong optionality in renewables, with onshore and even offshore wind capacities very large in more than a quarter of the cases, which would see a corresponding reduction in solar and batteries, whereas the much narrower ranges for CCS and gas-powered firming demonstrates their criticality across all decarbonised pathways. A note on nuclear before I hand over to Michael. Nuclear does not feature in the lowest cost solution to provide baseload or firming. It's featured in fewer than 25% of the cases across the 152 to a maximum capacity of about 9 gigawatts by 2050. So what does all this mean? Well, if the pathway to net zero is not technologically predetermined, and there are many possible solutions that give effectively the same total system cost, then we should therefore begin to contemplate energy system planning, which also includes reasonable and regional social and environmental objectives, as well as the national net zero targets. With that, I'm going to hand over to Michael.
Thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone. Oh, there's a clicker. Good. So we're now going to talk about energy use, emissions and targets. And we first show the energy consumption by sector in our core scenarios, those four that Simon talked about, by year. You can see the orange bit, electricity becoming much more significant across all end-use sectors. Yet, substantial forms of other form of energy, most significantly aviation fuel and also gasoline and diesel, remains by mid-century, including in two of our two net zero scenarios. So this inevitably requires other technologies to help achieve the net zero, as we will discuss later. And the very different scales of energy use in the transport, industry, commercial and residential sectors should be noted. This is something that we will also discuss in a moment. Now, we can also show, that was energy use by end use sector. We can also show the associated direct emissions for each of these end use sectors, along with those separated out for electricity, fugitives, that's the gas that just escapes to the atmosphere whether we like it or not, the land sector and also geologic sequestration. These direct emissions are generated by many sources. For example, in homes, it's the combustion of natural gas for home heating, cooking and water heating. As required, the sum of these different positive and negative emission sources equals zero once net zero is achieved in the two scenarios on the right-hand side, in 2050 and in 2065. And again, these very different scales of, this time, the direct emissions from transport, industry, commercial and residential end-use sectors are noted. Now, a lot of us, particularly myself, don't know a lot about the land sector. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm no agronomist or forestry specialist. So you might therefore be surprised, if like me, how important it is to the abatement task. Our projections for agricultural emissions, which are mostly methane from cattle and sheep, in our decarbonising cases, could be largely offset by a combination of various management techniques, including management of those methane emissions from cattle and sheep directly, some management of improved fertilisers through improved fertiliser use, but also reforestation of, in our assumptions, up to about 10% of all farmland. This is about the maximum that we were advised by people who know this stuff shouldn't lead to compromised agricultural production. And whilst these assessments are only updates from phase one, and we appreciate that a lot more needs to be done in this area, the key finding is that the land sector as a whole, so both agriculture and what we call LULUCF, the green stuff at the bottom, in combination is unable to provide, be a net source of abatement for other sectors by mid-century. Now this finding is important since it infers that deeply decarbonised futures with so-called residual emissions from sectors like aviation or steel, cement and chemical production need to find some other means of managing their greenhouse gas emissions in these net zero futures. And that form of management must involve carbon capture and storage, or what's called CCS, of some form. Something needs to compensate for any residual emissions by drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it. And if that isn't the land sector, then it must be some form of CCS. Now, barring multiple disruptive innovations occurring simultaneously, we might have new ways of doing all these things. Hopefully we will. But if we don't, or if we don't stop flying, making cement, steel and chemicals, growing cattle and sheep, and indeed use fertiliser, which, by the way, the world needs to sustain current population levels, we project that tens of millions of tonnes per annum of abatement from the land sector and from CCS are both required. Now, this is not a matter of liking or disliking land sector abatement or CCS. It is solely a statement of each resource's potential combined with the need to achieve low and hopefully the zero in net zero emissions. So we now bring these assessments together to consider how our scenarios compare with Commonwealth emissions and renewables targets. Before we do so, as Simon did, we emphasise that our modelling is different to others in key respects, independently undertaken, and importantly, it was completed before last week's release of the Commonwealth's 2035 targets and associated sector plans and policy actions. We first look at greenhouse gas emissions. With the solid black lines on these four graphs, the Net Zero Australia project's total emissions, because we include international aviation and shipping, and the dashed lines are projections of what is termed the national inventory. That's the stuff that Australia reports to the IPCC, the emissions that relate to our domestic targets, slightly different. Unsurprisingly, our reference scenario achieves little abatement since we have no greenhouse gas constraint or policy, and all technologies are built or shut down if they are part of a least cost system. Minimising costs, forget about greenhouse gas emissions. That's the reference scenario. Now, the other scenarios, of course, do a lot more. But even our most aggressive scenario, the Net Zero 2050 scenario, doesn't meet the Commonwealth's 2030 and 2035 targets, instead achieving about 50% abatement in 2035. That's by 2005 levels, of course. Now, importantly, Simon showed earlier that this 2050 net zero scenario, straight line abatement to net zero, requires up to 10% annual growth in the capacities of quite a few technologies. That these 2030 and 2035 targets are more ambitious in the next 5 to 10 years than a scenario with these unprecedented build rates underscores how challenging they are. So how anyone can argue that these Commonwealth targets are not ambitious enough is very hard to understand. Emphasising that this in no way questions the climate science, but is rather based on an assessment of how much we can build per annum. Our projections of renewable uptake are consistent with those for greenhouse gas emissions. We only see about 60% renewables by 2030 in our current policy scenario, which is quite a way short of the government's target of 82%. This result is likely not a supply to students of energy. However, I also draw your eye to the renewables in the reference scenario. That's the high emitting one with the 4 degrees plus of warming. Renewable share rises to almost 70% in that scenario. But this is only electricity, and energy consumption of all forms grow out to 2050. As such, we can have a lot of renewables and still not achieve a lot of abatement if we don't take care of a lot of things. And now to our famous maps. Here is a map of Australia's electricity transmission network today, with electricity transmitted mostly from fossil fuel generators to consumers across the nation. Hopefully, if you've got good eyesight, you can see some blue and orange dots. That's our current wind and solar farms, plus some fine lines that are the existing national transmission network itself. So we now move to one projected net zero future in 2050, emphasising that these maps are only indicative and are not a view of what needs to happen. As Simon showed before, there are many ways to net zero, and we hope that we can use this, particularly in this spatial kind of analysis, to meet reasonable social and environmental objectives. We can see hundreds of gigawatts of solar and wind across the nation, serving these domestic loads and connected by a significantly augmented electricity transmission network. However, we don't yet see the massive investments related to our exports. This is because we're only studying the domestic energy system tonight, and we'll be studying those exports in future, as Simon mentioned earlier. But this domestic serving transmission network isn't just electricity. We also see a new domestic transmission network for hydrogen pretty much in each state, and a new CO2 transmission network connecting major industrial emitters and biorefineries around the country to storage basins. These biorefineries turn biomass into hydrogen for use elsewhere and capture CO2 for geological sequestration. They are therefore a source of both negative emissions, carbon drawdown, and energy in the form of hydrogen, and are therefore useful in both respects. And finally, we move to costs and investment. and we need to be careful here. There are many ways to present costs, and not all of them are useful. Indeed, the arbitrary use of selected figures can be very misleading, as some have demonstrated. So let's try and be very clear on costs. We'll first look at what we call the levelised costs. By levelising, we mean spreading out the costs of all new assets over their lifetimes and adding these to their operating costs. And so these levelised costs are a measure of the costs each year that we may pay. As such, the graph on the left includes investment in new electricity generation of all forms, renewables and fossil, plus energy networks of all forms, several gases and liquid fuels, and many significant end-use appliances across all end-use sectors: homes, businesses, industry and transport. This is not just energy bills, what comes to your front door. This is the stuff inside your house as well, or inside your factory as well. Now, remarkably, the graph on the left shows that we spend almost $300 billion per annum on what we define as the energy system, of which roughly, as we'll discuss in a moment, 2/3 is transport related, and which is today primarily supplied by fossil fuels. Now, all these scenarios, including the fossil fuel intensive reference scenario, then rise in total cost to mid-century because we assume that the population grows. We think a reasonable assumption, using ABS projections for that. If we did nothing about climate change, that would mean new fossil generation replacing those that are today mostly old and which must then be retired. So in all scenarios, these projected costs per unit GDP then fall, since GDP growth includes population growth, but also, hopefully, productivity growth, amongst other things. So whilst our modelling shows that achieving net zero has greater total energy costs than doing nothing about climate change, these differences are projected to become smaller proportions of a future growing GDP. I also make 3 more points, given the importance of costs. First, you'll see on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, more than 95% of the sum of the future costs from today to net zero in 2050, we call this the present value, are going to be incurred anyway in the high emitting reference scenario. So keeping the lights on isn't cheap, whether or not we emit greenhouse gases. They're multi-trillion-dollar tasks, whether we abate or not. Second, out to roughly 2035, all these scenarios have similar costs. Certainly these differences are well within the uncertainty of our analysis. Hopefully the learning by doing during this period then helps us with later projected cost increases in the more deeply decarbonised futures ahead. Finally, and most importantly, we haven't yet quantified the additional investments required for climate adaptation and the cost of climate damages. Not because they are small, they are not, but because we haven't yet had the time or the resources to do so, and these are calculations that are better done by others and not a bunch of engineers and economists primarily. Nonetheless, these added costs for adaptation and climate damages should be included in any responsible analysis of the decarbonisation effort. Now, we now further consider this remarkable result that we spend almost $300 billion per annum right now on energy. Here we show our estimated current cost of $293 billion, almost 300, broken into spends on transport, industry, residential and commercial energy. That we spend about 2/3 of this total on just transport is doubly remarkable. How on earth is that possible? It must be wrong. Well, here's how we're not wrong. We currently buy about 1.2 million cars, new cars, each year. At $50,000 a car, let's say, that's $60 billion on new cars each year on its own. There's $60 billion or so out of that $82 billion. And then we also have new trucks, new buses, new e-bikes, new everything. Now these new cars, just talking about cars for a moment, form part of a national fleet that is about 17 million in total. Each of those cars uses about 100 millilitres of fuel per kilometre and travels about 14,000 kilometres a year on average. So at $1.50 a litre, that's without excise maybe, we then get 38 billion per annum on the cost of fueling cars alone, right? And then we've got trucks and buses and e-bikes and other things to push along as well. Now, similar calculations then find that road vehicle maintenance on its own is $50 billion. And we therefore see how you can quite remarkably end up with almost $200 billion just on transport. The other sectors are then much smaller total spends, with energy supply, transmission and distribution, and new appliances all being significant. This wide diversity of current costs is important to appreciate because they get substituted mainly from less capital intensive, high fossil fuel using appliances to more electrified, more capital intensive appliances in the future. So it's very important to think about this switching between fuel supply and appliance use. So now we look at the differences in costs between two of our projected 2050 futures, our 2050 net zero scenario and the reference scenario, remember the one that does pretty much nothing in terms of abatement. And we see from the earlier chart that the net zero scenario in that year is projected to be 42 billion per annum more than the reference scenario. Okay, how do we get this 42 billion per annum delta? Interestingly, with transport, and this is the substitution I was talking about, we see substantial substitutions between capital and operating expenditure. Going back to cars, this net zero 2050 future, everybody's driving an EV. But EVs cost more to buy and less to operate than their equivalent internal combustion engine driven asset, such that this sector almost nets out these differences. So there's not much additional cost burden in achieving a net zero a transport fleet that's consistent with a net zero objective. That's very good news for decarbonisation. Industry, we see about 12 billion added costs to just this sector. That's a concern. Residential and commercial, a net increase of only about 2 billion over these two sectors, since the added appliance costs, pulling out your gas heater and putting in an electrically driven heat pump, for example, are largely counteracted by reduced supply costs. More good news. Finally, the biggest ticket item, carbon management. This is the cleaning up. This is the residual emissions. These include all the costs of carbon capture and storage and is another concern. Finally, we look at all these costs on a per person basis and per end use sector today and in this net zero 2050 future. When we disaggregate it in this way, we get further insights. Residential costs see a rise of about $125 per person per year from today to 2050, this net zero 2050 world, but that excludes any transport costs. If we factor in 1 or 2 cars per household, which is typical, the total household energy costs are then projected to fall modestly because, as we can see in the middle of the table, the total cost of ownership of cars become cheaper on average to own in 2050 than they do today. We think this result just for households is a very important one. And hopefully it is one that should temper some of the fear-mongering around the decarbonisation task. However, this is certainly not to say that it is all plain sailing. These are average costs, and for example, low-income households will of course find paying for more capital-intense investments harder than high-income households, things that people already appreciate, and there are many schemes already for addressing these kinds of aspects of the transition. But we also need to keep the residential and commercial abatement task in perspective. These two end-use sectors have the smallest tasks at just about 5% each of the required total abatement to net zero. Industry mainly, but also heavier transport, are projected to see much larger cost increases, and and this is a major concern since these sectors need to do most of the abatement. So as we say in this slide, the importance of the industrial abatement task for net zero, combined with their significantly higher energy costs, suggests material risks for this sector. So we'll close out the seminar with a brief discussion of the work's implications. You've seen that before, so I won't go through it again. Implications. To reach net zero by 2050 to 2065, our modelling builds all of renewables, storage, electrification, natural gas generation and CCS at 5 to 10% per annum annual growth rates. If any of these cannot be built at these rates, then other unprecedented builds must do more. The large optionality in different fleets with essentially the same emissions and total transition costs suggests we shouldn't get hung up on preferred technology routes, the routes not technologically predetermined, and system planning might accommodate reasonable social and environmental objectives. For example, offshore wind and pumped hydro might displace onshore wind and solar and help reduce land use, particularly in very population-dense parts of the world like southern Victoria. Numerous factors, of course, will constrain this optionality in the real world. In terms of energy use emissions and targets, a straight line from today to net zero in 2050 is about 50% abatement in 2035 by 2005 levels. This is less ambitious than the Commonwealth's 2035 target range, but still requires annual investment and technology deployment at unprecedented rates. 2, the many existing decarbonisation energy policies should be rationalised and reprioritised. Those that remain should have a scale consistent with the net zero task, with mechanisms to drive that adoption. Carrots or sticks, we'll let the policy designers design. CCS and land sector abatement both have major roles in net zero future, and both should therefore be prioritised. That's just, we think, a statement of carbon balance. And finally, the net zero scenarios 2 to 3 degrees of warming suggest that adaptation should be a priority alongside mitigation. These significant costs of mitigation and adaptation are separate to those from climate damages. All of them need to be considered carefully. In terms of costs and investment, the residential and commercial sectors are each about 5% of the decarbonisation task, suggesting we should plan a more gradual transition for these sectors, which impact us all directly, whilst we target greater decarbonisation elsewhere. The immense scale of the transport sector and differences in decarbonisation costs by vehicle class and end user both suggest carefully tailored policy responses by vehicle class are required. And 3, given the current industrial environment, the added costs of decarbonisation risk further closures. Decarbonisation policy should therefore consider significant and tailored industrial support. Those cost impacts for industry are very significant. And finally, transitioning from primarily fossil fuel use to more electrified and more capital-intense systems presents significant and different financing challenges across all of those sectors, and that feeds in with some of the earlier comments. So that's it for the report. We've covered a lot, and I apologise if it's been too much. It likely has. But this is a very big, important and complex topic, and it is hard to take any of it out. I now invite 2 people to join Simon and myself on stage for a lively panel discussion and then open Q&A with you all. First, Meg McDonald has been a generous, very generous contributor to the Net Zero Australia Projects Advisory Group. We thank you for that, Meg. Bringing her decades of experience and insights in the sector to both an executive and public servant. So, Meg, please join us on stage. And many of you will know Ben Potter from his distinguished career as a journalist. 27 years at the AFR, wasn't it, Ben? Reporting on energy and climate-related issues over many years. So, Ben, thank you. Ben's moderating this evening. And finally, repeating Mark and Simon's opening comments. Sincere thanks to our supporters, APA, APGA, Energy Australia, Iberdrola and the Fenix CRC, our advisory group, and to the whole team who actually did the work. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just noticing we've got a good crop of questions coming through on the app or whatever it is, but You're allowed to put your surname there if it's not compulsory, but you're allowed to, and affiliation if that counts. If it's just student, then so much the better. Thanks very much, Simon and Michael, for the presentations. We now have a deeper understanding of the Net Zero Australia work, and one of the things that, or key thing that jumps out, I think, for probably a lot of people, is that Net Zero Australia are not modelling the success of the government's policies. You're modelling what you've described as a linear reduction in net emissions to 2050. But the outcome of that is that neither the government's 2030 or 2035 clean energy targets, emissions targets, or the Paris climate outcomes are achieved. So I think, Michael, is that something we should be concerned about? Does it still leave us with a strong case to act? And what are the policy implications that you see coming out of that?
Well, of course we should be concerned about it. We're just drawing straight lines from today in the net zero scenario, straight lines from today to 2050 or 2065. And the only reason we chose those two, 2050 is because it's a government target, but the reason we chose a straight line is we could have any line, and the answers broadly wouldn't be any different, but simultaneously we've constrained the annual build rates, as Simon mentioned. So straight line from today to 2050 is roughly considered with a 10% year-on-year growth rate in a whole bunch of these key technologies. And then if you then constrain the build rates to be lower to 5%, you inevitably therefore must push that straight line back to 2065 in this case. Similarly, if we said 15% or 20% annual growth rates, we could push that line forward. So we could push that line forward and we could go straight through the middle of the government's 2030 and 2035 targets if we wanted to. That's just a modelling choice. But a 10% year-on-year growth in 7 or 8 different key technologies is a grand task. And as Simon showed, we're talking about a factor of 5 or 6 growth in solar installations through that effort from what we're currently doing. So we'd all take deeper decarbonisation tomorrow if we could take it. We're not, as I mentioned, we're not questioning the climate science. We'd love to abate. We go to net zero tomorrow. We'd love that. Can we build fast enough to get to where we want to go to?
So that's the colossal. We'll come back to the colossal scale of the challenge. So that just in terms of some of the exclusions or emissions, you mentioned that this phase 2 report doesn't model green energy exports at all. And I was wondering, I noticed, I was struck by the fact that the Northern Territory only has 2 gigawatts of investment in renewables, whereas WA has 50 gigawatts, and I would have thought a fair bit of WA's effort is also export related. So I was wondering about the impact of that and just what effect the inclusion of a green export model might ultimately have. Simon, is that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of the split between Northern Territory and Western Australia, there are a lot of export opportunity, well, not exports, current exports that are associated with that state that aren't bound up in fossil, right? So iron ore is a massive export. We are also still continuing our exports of natural gas and coal, just at a reduced level in line with the announced pledges scenario. So that also plays into the energy demand for those sectors. And so you would have seen the transmission line, some of that is also being funneled down into Perth. So that sort of explains some of the differences. In terms of the modelling the energy export task is really complex. We need to not only understand what Australia can produce in terms of its own commodities and clean energy and at what price, but also at what price at what price our trading partners are likely to want those commodities at. And without modelling the entire world along the way we have for Australia, that becomes a really complex task. And so that's why it needs some more deep thought and why it's going to be a function of it's going to be the focus of a future report. You see the impact in terms of the total infrastructure build, and there's less activity. For those who remember our phase 1 results, we have solar Tasmanias across the northern Sunbelt. That disappears, but that's a sort of an extreme or simplistic take to see what it might look like. But we really need a more nuanced version, which is why we'll have a future report on that.
Meg, you expressed some interest in the contrast between the NZAu Australia report and the multiple reports and materials that the government issued last week, including all the various sector plans. What's your sort of concern or reflection on those contrasts?
One of the things that might have people might have noticed was the number of policies that were excluded from the modelling because they weren't of significance or were not fully committed, and that is one of the things that is driving some of the results from the modelling. If you look at the plans that were announced by the government and the modelling announced by the government last week, then the big question there is, will a policy sitting behind that get us there? And I think the answer is, at current rates, no. And therefore, it really highlights where that gap where we are really going to need to scale up a lot of the policies and the regulations, the carrots and the sticks, and to be very strategic about them, or we just won't make the build rates that are going to be necessary to underpin that. And that's not a late 2035, 2040 decision. That's a decision that really does need to be made now to set up for the capital replacement cycles that we're going to be getting into.
So I think the timetable the government has set is the safeguard mechanism, the new vehicle emissions standard, and the NEM review are all being in process, and they look like they'll be policies the government takes to the 2028 election. Could be wrong; they could jump the gun, but their natural caution kind of inclines you to think that. Is that too late? Do you think?
It needn't be, but it's a question then of the level of ambition. Is the current rate of reduction inherent in each of those policies sufficient to actually solve this and to get us there to actually increase that capital replacement cycle? That's a judgment that I think most people would say what's currently there is not, and therefore it really does require a significant lift in level of ambition across all of those different sectors.
And also, many people out there, I think Michael Liebreich of Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a principal one, very critical of the use of primary energy mix as a measure for the energy transition, because of the fact that fossil fuel based machinery is a lot less efficient than electricity-based machinery. But what it actually does show is that as you transition to renewables, you get a much more efficient use. We're getting much more in the way of energy services out of a much smaller primary energy amount. So,
and we also showed the end-use energy as well, which factors. It's all electricity, gasoline, diesel, refined products. So you're right, and that's a topic of fierce debate amongst energy system students, which is more useful. We showed both.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. And just what is the role, or how do your findings reflect the efficiency gains? Simon, or whoever wishes to.
Well, there are very vast efficiency gains. So that particular case I showed where there's a substitution, particularly in transport. Transport's just a dazzlingly large sector that I continue to be surprised by. So by 2050, for that reference case, you've got everybody still driving their big internal combustion engine driven vehicle, which is cheap, but it has high operating costs, particularly fuel costs. So then you substitute those vehicles with electrified equivalents, fully electric equivalents, all of a sudden the capex is more, but the operating cost goes down a lot. Now, there's two factors. It's the energy that pushes the vehicle along is just 4 times more efficient, roughly. Depends on the powertrain, blah, 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 but it's 4 times more efficient. The other thing is that EVs have lower maintenance costs as well. So that staggering number of 50 billion a year for maintaining road vehicles goes down in net zero as well. So that improvement in propulsion system efficiency plus the reductions in maintenance costs wipes out the capital cost burden of electrifying the whole transport sector, we think, pretty much.
Which is fantastic for sort of, light industry and commerce.
Well,
very bad for car dealers, which seems to be why they're complaining that there's no demand for a product that they're not putting much effort into selling.
Well, maybe not quite so good for mechanics. But it is heterogeneous though. So EVs, so the vehicles that we have at home, they fall in cost. But then if you've got a big B double and you own a big fleet of trucks or whatever and you're servicing a big heavy industry supplier, that can be much more difficult. So there's real heterogeneity in the transport sector itself.
Just looking at the cost, that's quite striking that we hear a lot about the cost of the energy transition, and in fact, your finding is that net zero 2050 is $42 billion more costly, or 12% more costly for the energy system costs, leaving aside other things that might or might not happen. But it's still sharply lower as a percentage of GDP, which sort of counts as national income. So what's happening there is the total cost of the energy system is not increasing in line with the size of the economy. Simon,
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, no, the total size of the energy system is increasing in line with the size of the economy. What's happening is that, well, there's a number of things that are going on there. One is that population and GDP are increasing as well, and so we see the total cost spread across a broader base, and so that's fundamentally why we see that decline. It declines across all the scenarios at roughly the same level. The net zero 2050 scenario slightly larger, but still within that 1% range of the reference case.
And that's a function of the capital cost going up, but the operating cost generally being a lot lower.
Yes.
Which is a really good thing.
Oh, I mean, we've used all of Gen Cost reports projections for the capexes of everything, right? So lots of stuff gets cheaper, particularly renewables and batteries, but everything gets cheaper, capital-wise. But therefore, the operating cost of your energy bills go down as well, if for the same level of decarbonisation. There's a lot in it, but population growth plus productivity growth and other factors means GDP grows more than population, and therefore, whilst our demand goes up with population growth, we become more efficient. Everything becomes better. So therefore, as a fraction of GDP, total system costs go down.
So Meg, this is not an outcome that you often see reflected either in media coverage or in the political debate about energy. So what is it about that? You can comment on the media, on whoever. But it almost seems counterintuitive given the focus on the cost of the transition.
Well, I think that's really one of the benefits of an exercise of this kind, actually, to start to unpick and look at the underpinnings of these various dynamics. And I think you'll find that, at least in some of the work that was put out by the government last week, there is a lot of that sort of evidence as well around what some of these productivity gains are, what some of the cost of living impacts are actually going to be for individual households and individual businesses, and really starting to look at the effects across the whole economy rather than just the energy system alone, because I think that has been the untold story up until now. And I think one of the other things that we why the next phase of this project is going to be really interesting in looking at the export side is that if you look at some of the drivers for investment, particularly across the industrial sector, a large part of that is actually going to be driven by external market forces, i.e. the rest of the world decarbonising and the expectations around that, around what our product mix will need to look like and how carbon intensive it will be. And so there are lots of those sorts of drivers that can help inform the nature of the next rounds of policy that need to be there. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think it's very complicated, as everyone in the team, I think, keeps saying there's so much in here. Really getting that kind of discussion underneath the hood is really important.
Now, I don't know who the timekeeper is, but I'm assuming we're running about 8 minutes late and adding 8 minutes to all the time deadlines on the schedule, so I'll continue doing that if that's okay. Now, one of the biggest factors, I guess, a phenomenon in the energy industry of the last few years, but is the plummeting cost of solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles. The report notes that it's pushing out wind power, it's pushing out pumped hydro, it's reducing the amount of transmission that's going to require to be built because of the battery's capacity to absorb excess energy. But it still leaves a humongous logistical and financial challenge to actually roll out the amount of new solar batteries and wind power that we're going to need. What's the, well, I guess that's just a comment, but the question I have on here is, Net Zero Australia's balance of rooftop and utility solar is at odds with AEMO's ISP. Even after it's going to be updated, I understand that, but it's still quite substantially different. Why doesn't rooftop solar benefit as much from falling solar panel costs as utility solar?
Oh, there's a very simple reason why. We've imposed the uptake of rooftop solar from the last ISP in our modelling, so it's not competing on an economic basis. And the reason for that is that how you model rooftop PV inside a distribution network, inside a transmission network, is mathematically really tricky to do in a least cost sense. So we just thought, oh well, we'll stick with the 70 odd gigawatts, whatever, that we have by mid-century from the ISP. But your point about utility scale solar really growing very, very strongly, and then you've seen that net zero 2050 scenario, wind staying at essentially a couple of gigawatts per annum for the next 25 years. When that result was first obtained, we were surprised by it. And that was using the very latest gen cost numbers. And we think it's just because the projections for wind costs are going up quite a bit. In the last couple of years, our wind costs in our own modelling have gone up by about 60 or 70%, whereas solar's gone up by about 20%. That's all that supply chain stuff that everybody's been copying, thermal plant and renewable plant as well. And batteries have come down by about 20%. So there could be some really big tipping points between batteries and solar, which are natural complements, and wind, and lots of switching there. But also Simon's showed that result around the optionality that we have. We're not stuck on the world needs 250 gigawatts of solar. If the world needs 100 gigawatts of solar and double the amount of wind, great. If it's optimal and it meets those social and environmental outcomes that we also want to meet, let's do it.
Now, is that 15 minutes? Is that for the entire session, or this? Okay, well, we better. Sorry about that. We better take some of the excellent audience questions that are coming through. There's a question from Will initially. Aside from cost, did you apply any other constraints to energy, especially to the energy, especially the electrical power system? For example, system security and or reliability. And I think there are microphones available also if someone wants to put their hand up.
Go ahead.
You go. So we model on an hour. So the short answer is that the complex task of managing system reliability and security is not undertaken as part of our model. To do that, along with the energy system planning, is computationally intractable. But we do, as I said, model on an hour-by-hour basis, matching supply versus demand. It will be a subject of a future report that Michael's going to lead. So we hope to have some more updates on that in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot to that analysis. You can't run this kind of big model and do that detailed security analysis in one go. No computer on the world's big enough.
Yep.
There's another question, I guess, another constraint suggested by Andrew, which is global supplies of relevant metals and resources. That my impression of that is that it's become less of a concern than it might have been a couple of years ago. Is that reflected in any way in the modelling?
So like our phase one modelling, we don't take into account any of those supply chain constraints. But this time around, because we've only focused on the domestic system, the Herculean task of the export system last time is now much smaller. And so those supply chain constraints or supply chain challenges, whether we have enough of those particular metals, whilst we aren't directly modelling that, those will obviously have lessened a lot. Like the size of the task is a tenth, just in terms of renewable build, compared to what it was when we considered the whole export task.
Peter and Martin, given increasing market capacity issues across all infrastructure and construction sectors, how can we practically, that's people and machines, and financially build out new carbon capture and storage infrastructure? How sensitive is the system configuration to CCS costs?
You probably know more about that one too.
So the optionality that we looked at, so the generating alternatives, indicates that CCS is really quite critical to the whole thing, and that there are a narrow range of outcomes, and that CCS is required across all of them. That's not to say that and as Michael pointed out in his a couple of slides, it's really a question of carbon balance. If the land sector can't afford these offset opportunities, then regardless of cost, CCS or engineered carbon removals are required. And so that's just that's what we see in the modelling. It's what we see in the generating alternatives. Is it challenging? Yes, but the build rates for all of these technologies, as Michael pointed out, are challenging as well.
But I guess what sort of plus and minus error do you think is in your bearing in mind this whole exercise is full of...
Of course, I mean, so what's the uncertainty in all this modelling? I wouldn't want to say. I mean, this is crystal ball.
But is CCS one of the larger ones, given the immaturity of it?
Of course, it's uncertain. I don't know what agricultural abatement costs really are when you really get tens of millions of tonnes a year from the land sector going. No one really knows that either, I don't think. But to Simon's point, particularly if you're modelling net zero, it's a mathematical thing. You're saying net zero is net zero, well then you're going to get a certain amount of stuff getting built, doesn't matter what the cost is. Now, the third option that we didn't talk about is you don't achieve net zero or you don't decarbonise. So if the CCS is really, really expensive and we decide we don't want to pay for it, then we can track closer to the reference scenario too. That's another option. But we just think that there's this first order coupling between the ability of the land to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and the ability of the engineered system to do similar things. And of course, we'll do the most that they can reasonably withstand with some reasonable economic constraint.
So with regard to the land sector, so this drove from Darwin to Melbourne middle of last year, and what the one thing we marvelled at, or were a bit shocked by, was the amount of there will be a cattle station, a wire fence, and you will see a cow about every 2 kilometres, and there's scrub and a lot of red dirt. So is that the optimal use of? I know you're not an agronomist, but seems to me there's a question there about whether that's an optimal use of that land as opposed to using it to grow biomass or something.
Or some combination thereof. We would love to study those things more, Ben.
Fair enough. Kate has a good question. If technological innovation alone is not enough, should we place greater emphasis on complementary measures such as demand flexibility, shared economic models, behavioural change, and more sustainable patterns of consumption? I'm going to ask Meg about that because it seems to be one that government would have dealt with quite a bit or grappled with.
I think the answer is you've got to do all of the above, but it's much, a lot of those things are just very, very hard to model and really beyond the capacity of this particular exercise where you can think, but they are very definitely the role of government to be looking at those sorts of programs.
But you can see why government shies away from telling people they can't have a steak or a sausage on grand final day. Or something, can't you? They're also very difficult for government to broach.
Yes, in terms of the cost, but it's also then the questions around regulation or just incentivising different behaviours.
Are there any questions out there? There's there are a couple by the look of things. So why don't we go to the 1, 2, 3? How's that?
Plenty of questions.
I'd like to know about industrial heat. Any scenarios?
What
Look,
would you like to know about industrial heat?
There's a question that relates to that, which is adjacent, which is what's the reason for neglecting? This is from Rachel. The possibilities of geothermal to produce both heat and electricity. So maybe you can consider them together.
So, on the geothermal one, it's not neglected. It's just that it's not cost optimal. Is the short answer. In terms of industrial heat, there are a number of technology choices that we evaluate in the modelling as part of the decarbonisation, and part of that is in the supply of different ways in which we supply industrial heat through fossil or decarbonised gas, through hydrogen, through electrification. Those options are included and evaluated for a couple of our larger industries. So it is incorporated in the, it's down in the weeds, but it is incorporated in all of the results that we see there, which is why there is a role for, which is why when you look at the industry sector energy use that Michael showed in one of his first slides, why there is a broad range of fuels, decarbonised fuels, as well as electrification that occurs. A good portion of that is allocated or would be allocated to the various provisions of industrial heat, whether they be low temperature steam or high temperature calcination, for example.
So industrial heat pumps is one of the pathways that I think one of the government documents, I think the NZAu plan last week, kind of very diplomatically hints that hasn't been followed as much as it might have been, and we know there's a lot of industrial heat below 250 Celsius or whatever it is that actually could be heat pumps instead of gas. So I think that's an area that needs a more policy.
Yeah, that's an area that we are in addition to doing the exports piece, we're also looking specifically at heavy industry and decarbonisation. So that will be a topic that we delve into in a lot more detail. I'd add though that there is the low temperature heat, but then the high temperature heat is not something that heat pumps could hope to address, and that requires a different technology solution.
There was another question in the middle and then across the side and at the back.
My beer's in the microphone. I'm Will, Policy Advisor in DPC. I'm keen to talk about data centres, specifically around they're quite...
Yeah, we used one for this work.
Oh, excellent, even better. Well, now you can add the huge demand of that to the profile. Yeah. So the big question really is around the implications on you open the doors to the masses of, say, Amazon to build all the data centres they want, and the impact to consumer bills and the energy system in Australia. Keen to get your thoughts on two things. One is the projected growth of data centres out to 2050. And secondly, what are the key mechanisms to ensure a controlled and sustained delivery of them?
Well, I think your second point is sort of beyond the realm of the terms of this project. And that's a whole policy question and a very important one, by the way, Will. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just getting prompted by one of the people who know the numbers properly. We actually have included data centre growth, load growth in our modelling, and it is the AEMO data centre projections, which I can't remember the exact numbers. It was, how much was it again per annum? Couple of percent. Yeah. So we are modelling data centre growth, but it's not as large as some of the more ambitious projections you've seen. But look, the thing is, if you double the cost, so if you double demand, there's therefore twice the number of people paying twice as much money for the stuff per unit energy, the cost of the energy doesn't necessarily change. So as long as you don't get bad wealth allocations, mums and dads and low-income households subsidising large data centre providers, then that's not necessarily a bad news thing. But it is a very uncertain and potentially a very large load for the nation, unless we're happy to have some of our more secure information housed offshore. I suspect
So
not.
we are getting the move along. So I think there's one up the back. Oh, sorry, one question there.
Hi there.
Make it quick, please, because we're...
Yeah, sure.
minutes
Okay.
from-
Calvin Lee.
Hello.
Calvin Lee Climate Centre. So this is actually, I think, a follow-up to a previous question. Sorry. This is a previous follow-up to a previous question. So we've seen a lot of interest from energy planners for energy demand management, particularly applications such as industrial flexibility. So was this included in your modeling and its impacts on your energy supply and demand analysis, and whether this could affect the types of technologies that are employed to give us firmed electricity, or even the sum of infrastructure that is actually needed at all?
We do model a bunch of flexible loads. I mean, obviously batteries are very flexible, electrolyzers, but a lot of the industrial processes we model as well have a reasonable degree of flexibility. But it's very important not to overstate the ability, particularly of large industrial loads, to provide demand management. I mean, easy way to provide demand management, turn the thing off, and you get more demand management if you turn it off, shut it down and go home, right? So that flexibility has to be carefully modelled. Otherwise, you're asking some of these big industrial loads to do things that could never be commercial. It's quite a complicated area to really get into.
But I think one of the conversations about data centres, to Will's point, in the US now is that there's actually quite a lot of data centre functions that can be switched off, or they can tell the bots to go to lunch and provide some demand response. So
they can.
We're still at a pretty early stage of exploring the demand
That's
response.
one very flexible, but at the moment not very large load.
Yeah, but there are also a lot of large industrial loads that aren't
That's
anywhere
flexible.
near as flexible.
We'll move it on because we're very close to the end. One question at the back.
Good evening, I'm Tommaso Mattia Preto from Climate Work Center as well. And a quick question, more on clarification question. Regarding, you show a slide where you said that on one of your scenarios, you only selected 11 policies out of many others. Could you tell us
40.
why and what these policies were? And also, given the latest announcements at the federal level on the, liquefied, low carbon liquid fuel, extra $1 billion plus the National Reconstruction Fund, how will this announcement affect your modeling, if any? Thanks.
Sure. So the 11 policies that are inside our current policy scenario are those that we assess to be significant. The most significant is the safeguard mechanism. From memory, the second largest is the capacity investment scheme.
Yeah.
Number 3 is the vehicle fuel efficiency standard.
Yeah.
I can't remember many of the others. A couple of state-based renewable targets and others. The stuff that was announced last week, we just didn't have time to incorporate in the modelling, of course. But it's very important to also keep remembering the scale of the task. 300 gigawatts of renewables, that kind of ballpark is a number that people have been throwing around for a few years for a net zero, fully renewable Australia, right? Roughly fully renewable Australia. So $10 billion right now would get you about 6 gigawatts of solar if you spend it all on solar. So numbers with Bs in them are impressive, but we're talking about hundreds of gigawatts of build and much of other stuff. So these are big tasks.
So I think we're into the 32nd round now. So there's a question about social attitudes and electric vehicles and how can we effectively achieve 100% EV take-up by mid-century. I think, in fact, the government expects a substantial number by 2035. So, Meg, what's...
I'm just going to
quick
say
answer to that?
it'll be what's available on the market that will dictate the choices. And so as manufacturers phase out internal combustion engines, more people will be just choosing the alternative.
Mm-hmm. And just for Simon or Michael, there's a question about long duration storage, especially in electricity and heating, but also industry and transport. To what extent are they considered? I assume they're in there.
Yeah, that is in there. Was that thermal storage or electricity storage?
All four: industry, transport, electricity, and heating.
So there are multiple forms of storage that are incorporated in the model, both across batteries and pumped hydro, as well as it's not storage, but they're flexible demand management that we see in some of the industrial loads as well. In terms of heat provision, it's incorporated in the answer to the first question.
Is there another one out there? Sure, yeah.
Thank you very much. Given the sort of the way that the recent Business Council of Australia report was kind of headline figured at 500 billion, it was all very scary, that number for the transition. I wonder about the...
I'm not sure which scary figure.
Oh, okay. I can
The Business
further
Council
elucidate.
put out a report ahead saying the more aggressive the target, the greater the cost.
62% 400 billion, yeah.
Oh, okay.
70% 500 billion or something.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Okay.
This is
please
wonderful
go on.
teamwork. I appreciate
Okay.
that, Ben and
Good
Meg. In any case, I just wonder about the responsibility of a report that you put out about trying to incorporate some sort of risk premium into what was the reference scenario and whether or not you considered that. So I think in your report you have static weighted average cost curves. But how sensitive do you think your results might be to introducing some sort of risk premium on the 2020 long-term emissions reduction plan, or even Treasury's modelling just did the disorderly transition
I think we got
scenario?
it.
And
So we do have, like new coal-fired power station has a very high cost of capital because of that risk premium. For example, in our modelling, that's all online now. Right now, there's a couple hundred pages of stuff, including a couple of pages on all our cost curves by technology. So we do have those risk premiums, but you're dead right. I mean, looking at the cost of climate damage, the cost of climate adaptation and other things, extreme weather events, that's a whole very important part of this whole grand effort, and it's not something that we can answer.
yeah, I think it's more about building that counterfactual, I think. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. But the counterfactual still here is an $8 trillion task from now to 2050 versus an $8.3 trillion task to get to net zero by 2050. So
Thank you for your time.
that's a useful counterfactual.
Thank you.
So I think that's it. So thanks very much, Michael, Simon and Meg, and thanks to the audience for being so attentive and coming up with such great questions. And thank you, Mark. And
Thank you, Ben.
please